I'm Gene Shipe. I'm going to spend a few minutes and help you to understand about this kind of furnace. This was known as a Franklin furnace. It had it in operation. This is known as a blast furnace, and it's called a blast furnace because it has to have forced air put into it. When the air is put into it, then that's a blast. This kind of furnace never shut off. Once you started up, you had to keep feeding the raw materials into it, and you kept the air blast on. What I want to do at this point is to help you understand, so when I talk about things about the furnace, that you'll be able to see what it looks like on the inside. I'm going to hold this up. I'll try to hold it steady to see if you can see what it is. The one that's upright is the one we're looking at. The one that's horizontal is another kind of blast furnace, but that was a modern one. So I hope you are able to see what we have here. Alright, we'll go on. This furnace was named the Franklin furnace after Ben Franklin. They had a habit of naming the furnaces after a lady, an event, or a situation. There were the Liberty furnaces, not too far from here. Then there were the Chalaski furnaces, which is basically an Indian name. And there were the Grove furnaces. On the other side of Roaring Creek, they had the Esther furnace, or across the river. So they named these furnaces again a specific name which meant something probably to the group that built it. This furnace was built by entrepreneurs. Half a dozen people felt that they could make some money and it would be profitable for them to build the furnace. First furnace of this kind was north of Boston, a place called Saugus, in 1650. Looked very much like this furnace. The style didn't change for 200 years. And that was set up to make, basically, to run a hammer mill. It was called, the name of the area was called Hammersmith, but a hammer mill that you could make items out of. You have to understand, or it's well to understand, that this furnace was part of the frontier. As the frontier advanced across the country, there was a great need for iron products. For example, when you put a building together, prior to the time of nails, you had to spend a lot of time making mortises, making dowels, and drilling holes. But when you got a furnace in the community, you could make cut nails, and then you could put things together relatively easy. So this was a part of the advancement of civilization as it came across our country. And the people that built the furnaces were pretty much like the people we have today that come into the community as different experts. If you're going to have someone build a bridge, people that know how to build a bridge come into the community. Had people here that traveled across the country that knew how to build furnaces. This looks like a pile of rocks. It's called a bank furnace because most of this stuff gets put in the top of the furnace. There's a 5-foot hole in the top of this furnace. It's unguarded. If you fell in during the operation of the furnace, probably they hired a new person the next day. There wasn't much in the way of safety devices, but it was important for the furnace to be built into the bank, so you had a ramp that would easily access the top of the furnace. Furnaces needed basically 4 things to operate. They needed the wind. That came maybe originally from the earlier furnaces, from huge bellows that were powered by a water wheel. Then later on, when the steam engine came along, they had different kinds of bellows that would provide the air pressure. But anyhow, it was necessary to have a source of power, either steam or, on the earlier furnaces, water power to run the pumps that pump the air through. So you needed the blast. That's what the blast was. Then you also needed three raw products. You needed iron ore, which basically, this is a piece of iron ore that was supplied by Herman Jones from some land that he owned. This was a typical iron ore, the most plentiful. And I think it had probably around 25% iron, maybe 30%. There was a heavier iron called hematite, but this was a kind of iron ore. So that's one of the things you needed. The other thing you needed was a kind of fuel. This furnace was operated by anthracite coal. The picture that you saw, the diagram you saw of the furnace, was operated, was fired by charcoal. Interesting, it took 120 acres and 12 men to make the charcoal each year for this furnace. So you could see in very short time the land would be denuded of trees, and that caused a lot of problems in the British Isles. The other thing that you needed was a piece of, well, not a piece, but you needed several tons of limestone. The limestone would melt, and that would take the impurities out of the iron. So we have iron ore, fuel, and limestone that's needed to operate the furnace. Now let's go back to the appearance that you saw of the first furnace. Here's how it would work. Charges would be thrown into the furnace, and an exact recipe was made. You just couldn't haphazardly throw things in. You had to have so much limestone, so much fuel, and so much iron ore. And that had to be exact. This furnace had to operate at temperatures around 2800 degrees. That's not easy to do. If you get too much of a blast going through, it'll cool it off. If you don't have enough, it doesn't get hot enough. So everything to the furnace, even though it was a pile of rocks, was built to fairly exact specification. The man that designed the furnace, that built it, then knew how to set up the air and the amount of fuel so you get to 2800 degrees. Charges went in at the top of the furnace. Probably had 2 people up there working to throw into charges. And there would be a recipe for making a ton of pig iron. Pig iron gets its name because when the furnace was tapped, the iron would come out of a spout of the furnace and run on some very flat beds of sand. Just enough tilt to them to let the iron run down a center channel, which was called the sow, and off to the side, which then would make pigs. So that's where the name pig iron came from. And it came when you tapped the furnace and drew the iron off of the bottom of the furnace. So now we have the event of starting up the Franklin furnace. There was a fire built in it, a brush, and a lighter wood for about a week to dry it out. The furnaces are lined with mud, clay, because that could stand the heat. So you have to get the furnace dried out. That took about a week. And then in a big ceremony, they would start the furnace up and run it probably for 48 hours. When the big event came, that you'd make the first tap. The fuel was thrown in, the limestone was thrown in, and then the iron ore was thrown in. And that made layers. If you could refer back to the diagram that we looked at the beginning, it showed the layers of these. The way the furnace was shaped was like 2 upside down, or, well, an upside down ice cream cone and another one that was right side up. The top part of the furnace, the sides were sloped out, so everything would keep dropping down. The bottom of the furnace, the sides were sloped in, so it would not fall down into your melted iron or to your fire. So the charges were put in, the blast was run, the furnace was started up, and now at the bottom of the furnace in the crucible, there would be an accumulation of slag, which would be the waste product combined with the limestone, and then would be the iron. There was not much iron at the bottom of the furnace. You think maybe it would be a foot deep, but it wasn't. But iron, they'd melt it, so maybe there'd be 6 or 8 inches of iron at the bottom of the furnace. It would stay hot because of the continuous hot fire going in the crucible. When you got ready to tap, when you had enough of the slag and the iron ore down, you would tap and get the slag off of the top first. And that would run out, and they would catch it in a slag buggy, something that you could wheel away while it was still in the molten stages, and that would be dumped. Chances are the last guy that was hired, that was his job. Or maybe they hired a mule. But mules were expensive. You could get people a lot cheaper than mules. So they probably did not have a mule. They just had someone to wheel that out by hand. So you have the tap in the furnace comes out of a small, durable-lined hole. And what happens, you have a clay plug in that that's shaped like an ice cream cone. When you want to tap it, you knock the clay plug out, you take the slag out, and then below that you have another tapping hole where you can take the iron out. So you tap the furnace and get the slag out and then bring the iron out. It would run out into this casting floor, the sand bed, and run into the sow and the pigs. And when the tap was done, you inserted another ice cream cone of clay into it and twisted it, and that would plug up the hole. That had to be done very carefully, because if you left the iron get hard in the tap holes, then you couldn't get the furnace tapped. The other blast furnace that we looked at was a cupola. This is the one that was on the side. Actually, the picture was horizontal. I worked in a foundry where the cupola man, the guy that operated the cupola, used to put the heat on. That was a blast, and then he would go over to the local bar to get a couple beers. They said, "You can't do that." And he said, "Well, yes, I can." So they fired him. But that wasn't any problem. They got a man who knew how to run this cupola. They got him in and they melted the iron. The cupolas were a little bit different because you fired them up every day. But anyhow, they melted the mixture of iron that you were going to put in the molds. He tapped it and it went okay. He put the clay plug in, and then the next time he went to tap it, he couldn't get a tap because the iron had come out and got in the tap hole and solidified. So he's there banging away, has a big rod and a strong guy hammering on it, and they can't get it, the tap made, and pretty soon a stream of iron, probably as big as my arm, come out through the side of the cupola, ran around, hit water, and exploded. So, I guess the point in this story is that you really had to know what you're doing. Making iron ore into pig iron is a very dangerous job, and so you can't go about it haphazard. That's the reason that the furnace, even though we look at it and don't see much in it, the man that built it knew exactly how to build it. It was an art and a science, and he knew how to fire it up. So basically what happened with this furnace, they started up in 1845. That's when it was put together. And they expected to make good money. By 1860, it was sold as a property. The furnace was of no value. They started up the furnace so they could send pig iron into the big mill. It was really had a tremendous sales for making iron T-rails. And they thought, well, that'll be a good market. The iron ore is up in the mountain, it's all downhill. The limestone is very close, and we can get the fuel from the railroad, Reading Railroad that just went through. Problem was, out in Youngstown, in the Pittsburgh area, right on the verge of furnaces that could really produce iron ore into pigs. This furnace produced about 500 tons a year. The furnaces that came online about 15 years after this was built, could produce 2,000 tons a day. So you can see, plus the fact that they were making steel, which was a much better thing for rails. This was iron. But, so the furnace sort of is an example of a small group of men starting a business. They're taking a risk. It didn't work out very well. But we still had the Franklin furnace as a souvenir and as a historical icon that we have. And that's what enabled me to stand here and talk to you about the Franklin furnace. I hope this has been a fair time for you, that you understand how pig iron is made and how it was made in these days, and these were very brutal jobs. One other thing, I must tell you this. The furnace never shut off. There were noxious fumes coming out the top all the time. There were 2 double homes up at the head of the hill where the workers and their families lived. You could not walk to Danville and back and work 12 hours a day. The people that worked the furnace had to live here. So now they lived here with their families. The well for the company homes was down at the bottom of the hill. So that means the women had to carry the water up. And also, weather like this, it's probably going to hit 83, 84, 85 today. Weather like this, you had the windows open. And all the noxious fumes came out. The wind came from the west, blew across the furnace, and carried the fumes through the house. And so, you see, it wasn't only tough for the man who worked 12 hours a day, it was tough for the whole family. So, with that, I'm going to close. I hope this is a good time for you. Thank you.